All right, thank you guys all for joining us. Robert, Tanya, are you good if we get started?
Ready to roll?
Well, fantastic. Thank you guys all so much for joining us today. It's a pleasure to introduce this webinar to you. So just a quick background, my name is Victoria Plichak. I'm a policy associate at the Energy Access Project at the Nicholas Institute for Environmental Policy Solutions here at Duke University. And it's my pleasure today to introduce your speakers, Robert Bonney and Tanya Vujic. But first, let me just say a little bit about our format for the webinar today. So Robert and Tanya will start by sharing the findings of the report for the first 40 minutes or so. And then there'll be 15 to 20 minutes of Q&A. We are recording this. So all of this recordings will be posted on our YouTube channel, and you can get access to that at a later date. So just to let you guys know, you should all be able to see a Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. If you have any questions for the speakers at any point in time during the presentation, please ask your questions through that Q&A function. And at the end, I'll jump back in and we'll go through those questions with the speakers at the end of the talk. You should also have access to a chat function. You should know that everything you write in the chat box will only go to the panelists. So if you're having any technical problems, if you can't see us right now or you can't hear me right now, please message us through the chat box and we can try to fix those technical issues as soon as possible. But if you have any questions for the speakers, please do put them in the Q&A box. So today we have Robert Bonney and Tanya Vujic, as I mentioned, sharing the Nicholas Institute's latest report on natural climate solutions, entitled Rural Investment Building a Natural Climate Solutions Policy Agenda that Works for Rural America and the Climate. So we'll start off with Robert Bonney, who is an executive in residence here at the Nicholas Institute, specializing in issues related to climate change and natural resource conservation with a focus on rural America. Before joining us, Robert served as Undersecretary for Natural Resources and Environment at the US Department of Agriculture. And we also have Tanya Vujic, who is the Director of Biogas Strategy at Duke University and an Assistant Professor of the Practice at the Environmental Sciences and Policy Division at the Nicholas School of the Environment. So I'll leave any further introductions to Robert and Tanya. And thank you guys so much for talking to us today.
Great. Victoria, thank you very much. Victoria forgot to add that she played a key role in the work we're going to talk to you about today, along with Shannon Arata. First, I want to thank all of you for joining us on a beautiful Friday afternoon, at least here in Northern Virginia. And I want to hope everybody is healthy and safe in some difficult times. But again, thanks for joining us. So I want to talk today about a report that we've put out on natural climate solutions, in particular using agriculture and forestry in the United States to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. As many of you know, the science is increasingly telling us that we need to significantly reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the US to net zero by 2020. Natural climate solutions have a very important role to play in that process. In the US, forests account for somewhere in the neighborhood of 11 to 15% of the CO2 emitted every year. That's the size of the forest sink. So every year the forests pull back out of the atmosphere somewhere in the neighborhood of that 11 to 15%. So forests already play a critical role. Agriculture also has an important role to play. Agriculture in the United States is about 9 to 10% of US greenhouse gas emissions. A little more than half of that is in nitrous oxide associated with soil management, use of fertilizer and manure management. About 41% or so is methane, and the remaining is some liming and a few other things. But there are real potential opportunities in both the US forest sink as well as in agriculture to enhance sinks, to sequester more carbon out of the atmosphere, but then also particularly on the agricultural side to reduce emissions. And the good news is that there's actually a lot of alignment between the types of management practices we want to see in our forests and agricultural lands and things that are actually good for forests and farms and ranches. I used to work on endangered species policy, and we don't always see this alignment on endangered species. So for example, if you want to protect a species that lives in old growth timber, there can be substantial costs associated with that. In this case, as we think about climate change, that alignment is that there are actually these things are often, these practices that we want to see done are actually often beneficial to both forests and agriculture. And so that's good news. The other place where there's a lot of alignment is a lot of the practices that we want to see done in both agriculture and forestry also enhance the resilience of those systems to climate change. And so that alignment is good. It's good both from a standpoint of how we make investments and how we think about making those investments, but also as we think about building alliances with folks in agriculture and forestry, that alignment is important. At the same time, climate change, as many of you know, is a polarizing issue in the US. We see a lot of polling that says that the American people are increasingly concerned about climate change. But even so, it's still polarized across political party, and it's polarized across the urban-rural divide. I make a reference here in this slide to some research that I and others have done at Duke University on rural attitudes towards the environment. And as part of that study, we actually looked into the way rural folks view environmental issues, environmental policy, and climate change in particular. And what we found is that there's a strong stewardship ethic across rural America, that rural Americans care just as much about the environment as urban and suburban Americans, that when you ask rural Americans about economic trade-offs, they're willing to place more emphasis on environmental protection, even at the cost of curbing economic growth. But when you ask rural folks about how important it is that the United States take action on climate change, you start to see a divide between urban and suburban voters and rural voters. And what we found in our research is that one of the clear cleavage points for the urban-rural divide is around government oversight, particularly the federal government. Rural voters, regardless of party, Democrat, Independent, Republican, are typically less likely to want to see significant federal oversight, or less comfortable, I should say, with significant federal oversight in environmental policy. And so that bleeds over into rural attitudes on climate change. When you ask voters how important climate change is, you see that rural voters about 15% or so lower in this national poll that we did. And if you do an analysis of attitudes towards government and people's attitudes on whether we should take action on climate change, people's attitudes on government are actually a really good indicator of what they think about taking action on climate change. And as part of this research, we actually interviewed agricultural leaders, forestry leaders, folks in rural government, African-American landowners, tribal leaders across the country. And the quote you see here on this slide is from one of our landowners or one of our agricultural leaders from North Dakota. Basically saying like, look, yes, the climate is changing, but a lot of folks in agriculture are concerned because if they talk about climate change, they're worried about the policy consequences associated with new policy. And so the real focus of our report and the focus of the conversation here today is to try and offer some solutions to the question of what does the menu of policy ideas look like that can both support natural climate solutions at the scale we need to meet aggressive climate goals by mid-century, at the same time that it garners rural support. That we can build a set of solutions that rural America looks at and is supportive of, and at the same time it solves our environmental needs. So let me give you a little sort of policy background to frame where we are in the policy landscape now at the federal level. So for the last 2+ decades, we've been living in what I've called offsets world. We assumed in Kyoto Protocol was built around cap and trade and emissions trading, and in US policy, we've assumed that we were essentially going to have a cap and trade program. Whether it was McCain-Lieberman in the 2000s or the Waxman-Markey bill that was debated in 2009 and 2010, the assumption is that we're going to have offsets and that restrictions, we're going to impose a cap and create restrictions on companies And that to finance natural climate solutions, we're going to essentially allow offsets. And those businesses that are subject to a cap are going to purchase carbon offsets from forest landowners, agricultural producers, and others. And that this is how we were going to fund natural climate solutions. But we're living in a world today where it's not clear we're going to have a cap and trade program. Many would like to see a carbon tax. It's not clear what policy looks like in the US at the federal level. Even if you were to get a new administration that would be more open to climate legislation. So there's a lot of policy uncertainty, and that policy uncertainty at the federal level means we have policy uncertainty as it relates to natural climate solutions. Are we going to finance things through offsets? Are we going to need direct federal investments? And so while public opinion has moved dramatically on climate change, we're in a situation right now where there's some uncertainty about what the policy mechanisms are. What we do know is that if we're going to reach scale, if we're going to protect the forest sink we have, enhance it, reduce emissions in the agricultural system, even as we look at ways to sequester carbon in soils, that's going to require significant investment. And that means we're going to need rural support. If we're going to get to the scale of investment we need, this is something where we're going to have support from those rural stakeholders. And so the fundamental question that we're trying to answer in this report is, what is the policy menu that gets us there? So the first thing we ask is where are the tons? Where in agriculture and forestry can you generate the reductions to meet those climate targets? And we've looked at in the report, we've looked at a number of studies. We've looked at the scientists at the Nature Conservancy, at World Resources Institute, the National Academy, the mid-century strategy that the Obama administration put out in late 2016. And there's some clear areas of agreement. One thing we know is that forests are going to be important. So you see here reforestation on the Boise National Forest and on the left-hand side in the wake of a fire. We know that reducing emissions from fire, but in particular, investing in reforestation and investing in improved forest management across the country is going to be really important. On the agricultural side, there's enormous opportunities for soil sequestration through soil health practices, cover crops, conservation tillage, no-till. Nutrient management is really important as it pertains to nitrous oxide. In the livestock sector, reducing enteric emissions from livestock, but also thinking about ways to capture methane are really, really important. So there's a lot of opportunity. But as you think about how to put together the coalition that can actually move this forward, thinking about the geography of where those natural climate solutions happen on the landscape is important. And so one of the things we talk about in the report is this geography of sinks, as it were. And so as you look at the slide on the left-hand side, this is methane potential from livestock spread across the country. And you can see it's relatively evenly spread, right? And it's centered on areas with large livestock production, dairies, hog farms, and others. And so there's a lot of opportunity across the country. As you think about building that coalition, you're going to reach a fair number of folks, a fair number of states with efforts to reduce emissions from livestock. But take the example of wheat, which is the map on the right-hand side of this slide. And you'll see wheat is more focused in areas where, in the Great Plains, areas where maybe soil's a little less productive, a little less water, but a really important crop. If all you were to do was to put a price on carbon and incentivize reductions, you'll get a lot of play across the country from livestock producers who are reducing methane, but the value of carbon to wheat producers might not be as great. And we saw this during Waxman-Markey. The wheat producers were somewhat concerned about Waxman-Markey, both because they felt like it had impacts on their input costs, but at the same time, putting a price on carbon and allowing offsets maybe didn't make up for that and provide enough benefit. So if you were to think about how to build climate solutions for wheat producers, you might actually think about helping improve the resilience of the crop, helping genetics of wheat so that they're more competitive internationally. The point here is that if we're going to build a broad menu of items that we have to think beyond just where the carbon is and think about what's valuable to those producers. The same thing is true if you think about forests. This is a map of forests across the US. If you look at the red, that is, those are federal lands. You see concentrated in the West, areas where fire and large-scale forest restoration are going to be important to reduce the impacts of fire, areas where we can do reforestation on the national forests. In the East, the place where we're actually sequestering the most carbon, forests are largely in private ownership. So thinking about not only reforestation, but improved forest management, valuing carbon so that landowners can produce more carbon through their forest management, but also things like wood products markets become really important to incentivize investments in forestry. The same is true as you think about the West and those markets that are going to help support large-scale restoration. The point is that we put together the coalition, geography matters. And so thinking about putting together a menu of policies that can reach out to a broad enough piece of agriculture and forestry while also solving our environmental goals is important. So let me hand it over to Tatjana now to talk about stakeholder interests. Tatjana, you may be on mute.
My computer is not cooperating. Hi, everybody. I'm going to cover stakeholder interests and talk about state policies that have been, that we evaluated in terms of natural climate solutions trends. Robert, I'm going to let you you're driving the slides, so I'm going to, I'll let you know when I'm ready to move to the next one, if that's okay. Now on the stakeholder interests, you're going to see on this slide, just in terms of how we approach this work, we casted a pretty wide net and compiled a pretty extensive catalog of stakeholders, which generally fell into 5 categories. I think we delve into a few more categories in the report. I've put these up on this particular screen, the 5, and I'm going to narrow in on forestry, agriculture, and rural stakeholders. With respect to forestry stakeholders, what we found is that this is a pretty cohesive group when it comes to attitudes about climate change and climate policy. And we recognize the various representative stakeholder groups have already started coordinating basically a shared policy platform and some shared goals around climate policy. The Forest Climate Working Group is a good example of this. The issues that come up with forestry in the forestry sector include expansion of markets for wood products, enhanced sustainability, and Western forest land issues, in particular wildfire control. This is really important because wildfire control can yield a lot of climate benefits. Prevention of massive releases of greenhouse gases during catastrophic events is really important because it's possible that those 5, I mean, this is what happens with fires. When that happens, they're canceling out all that great sequestration that forests are providing. Finally, next, I'd like to touch on the agricultural sector. Here we found in reviewing the various stakeholders that the policy agendas are generally more varied, and that extends to attitudes and platforms around climate policy. With agriculture as compared to forests, crops and agricultural products naturally are highly varied, and that manifests in a variety of positions and interests. The same holds true for agricultural stakeholders' positions on climate and natural policy solutions. The key then, takeaway here, seems to be that the natural climate solution policies need to be designed so that they can satisfy these varied stakeholder interests, which in some cases may naturally be at odds. So for instance, a livestock producer wants to keep feed prices low, while a corn producer is going to welcome mandates to drive up price. So So going back to, you know, finding those policies that work for the stakeholders in this space, that's the line that needs to be walked. I want to also touch upon, and finally touch upon rural stakeholders with respect to the more traditional groups. We noticed more traditional rural organizations. We noticed a strong preference for less regulation and more financial incentives, and especially incentives aimed at job growth and increased access to technology and innovation. Broadband comes up a good deal, which has benefits to rural communities, of course, and also can support NCS practices, particularly for data collection and reporting. Robert, can you move to the next slide? There we go. Now, on state policy, I'm going to focus on offsets and renewables primarily. At the state level, what's happened is there's been a considerable driver of carbon offset policy and incentives. And what we see with those is a allowance of these carbon offsets for compliance purposes. It helps particularly with forestry offsets and with improved forest management, avoided forest conversion, and for livestock methane. Those seem to be the most the carbon offset projects that really have taken hold thanks to carbon offset incentives. They've led to some great offset projects with respect to, especially with respect to livestock methane and forestry, as I mentioned. They're somewhat limited in California, while the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, RGGI, which mostly operates in the Northeast, has set targets that the utility sector could meet pretty easily with the targets they set for the utility sector. So they didn't really even need to dig into offsets for compliance. So the general takeaway there is it creates a lot of excitement and early activity into looking at carbon offsets. And then, you know, when you dig a little deeper into these carbon offset opportunities or mandates, I should say, compliance opportunities, the opportunity doesn't match the level of excitement, so that there's a lot more offsets that could be had, but the programs that are set up can't possibly kind of satisfy that supply. That's something to keep in mind moving forward. Another thing with offsets is that there can be significant political resistance against offsets. In the case of California, a lot of environmental justice issues came up with respect to offsets. Also in California, there's not a lot of room, like I said before, generally for offsets to play a role. I think it's close to 5% of the targets that can be met with offsets. And then I believe only half of those can come from out of state. So again, you know, it can drive a lot of excitement and then can tamp it down quite a bit once you start digging into these programs and seeing that the demand is not quite as high. Finally, I want to talk a little bit about renewable energy portfolio standards. They're very popular across a variety of states. And what they've done is they've helped to drive some renewable energy projects, particularly with methane, renewable natural gas. And that's also happening, that happens in particular in REPSs that allow for recognized ag-sourced renewables. Another really big driver has been California's low carbon fuel standard. If we're talking about states, I'm just going to talk about that rather than the federal RFS. And I think of all of the programs, that's probably been the most successful in terms of catalyzing some big supplies and a lot of activity and market creation around reductions related to methane in particular. Now the last slide is focused on the Climate Alliance states. There's folks, I believe, on the call from USCA, so maybe at the end you can let me know if I got anything wrong here. But for those who aren't familiar with USCA, it's a bipartisan coalition started by state governors, and about 24 states participate. You'll see the map there. And these states have committed to the Paris Agreement climate goals. USCA focuses on state cooperation so that states can help other states in achieving reductions. Now, the reason we paid special focus to the US Climate Alliance is because as part of their strategy, they recognize the reduction opportunities from natural and working lands. And so that features prominently in the strategy that they promote with their states. What's particularly worth noting is at the state level, USCA has been facilitating the identification of best practices and helping prioritize carbon sequestration opportunities and how to accomplish them. A significant kind of initiative is the Natural Working Lands Challenge, hashtag NWL Challenge. And several states have signed up for this in particular, and other actors are welcome to sign up as well. That particular challenge has led to a lot of important strategies and tools, such as for modeling carbon sequestration opportunities on natural and working lands. They also look for strategies that will help with resiliency. So trying to pair carbon reduction, sequestration, mitigation with resiliency benefits. An important opportunity that seems that could be looked at or modeled from USCA is the modeling capability that they're helping states start to build. That could be a tool that could help states in terms of prioritizing their the highest yield opportunities in NCS, and could also be a model for the federal government to serve as a role in terms of supporting those the implementation of those modeling tools across all states, and then being able to compile that information and start to direct funds in the right places, sort of in the vein of what Robert was talking about in terms of knowing where the tons are and knowing what practices will yield the greatest carbon reductions or sequestration. It starts to help to get at those practices sooner rather than later. And again, the key is implementing this stuff as soon as possible so NCS can start getting to work. So I think that is my last slide.
Great. So thank you, Tanya. Want to shift into what the policy agenda looks like at the federal level, and I want to start at the level of policy principles. Clearly, to win both agriculture and forestry, we need to think about market and incentive-based approaches. We need policy options that recognize the importance of climate mitigation, but also look at climate resilience. Increased productivity of agricultural lands, particularly in the face of climate change, will be important. We need flexible tools that can be adapted to the variety of agriculture and forestry, both across those various crops, but also across different landowner types. Tanya just talked about the importance of integrating federal policy with state-led initiatives. One of the exciting things about the Climate Alliance is that there will now be opportunities for the federal government to partner with states in locally led, state-led efforts to address that. Clearly, the task is big when it looks to the size of the reductions we need in natural climate solutions. And so government funding alone won't accomplish that. We need to figure out ways to leverage private capital, to get investments from landowners, from others though. And so policy ought to look to ways to leverage private capital. These types of programs don't implement themselves. We're going to need to invest in technical assistance, in staff to help implement programs, but it doesn't just have to be government staff. We can tap into existing networks of conservation groups, of commodity groups, of soil and water conservation districts, states, and others. Equity is particularly important. I'm going to touch on this a little bit later, but in particular, in the implementation of USDA programs, it's absolutely critical that we take into equity considerations around minority landowners, beginning farmers, and others. And of course, there's going to be important need for research and development. I'm trying to move my slide and not having any luck here. There we go. Sorry about that. So we just want to, before I move into specifics on our policy, I just want to answer the question, sort of what's working in conservation? And this is a bit of a summary of the principles I just walked through. So if you look at conservation, whether it's species conservation, ecosystem conservation, what's really working right now across the country, whether it's the restoration of longleaf pine in the South or the sage-grouse initiative in the West, which put sage-grouse conservation on more than 5 million acres in the West, efforts to protect land like the crown of the continent in Montana. The common tie amongst all those is collaborative, locally led, incentive-based conservation. And we think when people look at the types of policies, both that can work from a standpoint of getting the environmental benefits we need, as well as that can work for producers, for farmers, ranchers, and landowners, we think this kind of collaborative approach is an important framework. So let me talk about some specific policy incentives now that we go into some depth in the report. So we've talked a little bit about offsets, and Tanya talked about some of the experience with California and with RGGI. Some of it's been mixed, right? There have been some awesome projects done through AAB 32, incredible projects. Offsets still suffer from kind of two types of uncertainty, however. The first is that a lot of landowners worry that if they make a long-term investment, how do they know that carbon is going to pay them back, right? So there's sort of price uncertainty from landowners. Will my investment be justified by returns from a carbon market? Environmentalists worry that maybe if it's a compliance offset, how do I know a ton is a ton is a ton? How do I know they're going to be, the benefits are going to be long lasting? They're going to be additional. And this is going to be any type of offset program. These are going to be issues that are going to be played out. So looking to tools to deal with both of those types of uncertainty on the landowner and producer side, as well as the environmental side, is going to be important if we move towards some type of a compliance offset in federal policy. One way to deal with the uncertainty may be by establishing something like a carbon bank. So the US Department of Agriculture under a carbon bank could basically go into the carbon business. There's something in the Department of Agriculture called the Commodity Credit Corporation. It was basically established to help landowners deal with the vagaries of markets. It's been used in a lot of different ways. In fact, it's being used right now to help farm producers deal with the challenges of trade policy right now. But you could think about actually using the CCC to both put resources into natural climate solutions and also deal with both the price uncertainty and the environmental uncertainty that you see with offsets. Essentially, USDA could go into the carbon game. It could operate a reverse auction where it asks landowners or groups of landowners more likely to come forward with locally led or state-led projects. And it could help finance those through, again, a reverse auction where it basically chooses projects either with the lowest price or that have the largest environmental benefit. A bank could also operate potentially an insurance mechanism, providing insurance to particular types of projects to take care of some of that risk that both farmers and ranchers as well as forest landowners are concerned about. or it could guarantee a floor price. Again, thinking about a carbon bank is a way to both put liquidity into these efforts, that is to actually get funding out there, and to design things that will both work for producers and landowners at the same time that we address some of the concerns on the environmental side. Another type of policy has been talked about is tax incentives. There's a lot of interest in 45Q on the carbon dioxide removal side, on the technology side. You could also think about tax incentives as a way to advance carbon sequestration in lands. There's some challenges with tax incentives. How do you design them? How do you create accountability mechanisms? How do you know the taxpayer is getting what they need? And so the back end of kind of accountability may be difficult. And you also have to decide what it is you actually want to create a tax incentive for. Are you paying for practices, or are you actually paying for tons? So the design issues on tax incentives are important. Picture you see here is of a conservation reserve program land with Pheasants Forever sign there, and Pheasants has helped enroll lots of lands in the CRP program, but there are lots of farm bill programs like CRP that could be enhanced to do more for climate change. CRP has been incredibly important in restoring grasslands and in forest lands in the South, grasslands in the Great Plains. It's sequestered a lot of carbon. So there are ways that you could use programs like CRP or the Environmental Quality Incentive Program in the Farm Bill to enhance those programs to do more for climate. The challenge with that is that those programs were built to do other things: wildlife conservation, soil conservation, irrigation efficiency, all really, really valuable. And so if you build climate in, you're going to be concerned about competing resources. But Farm Bill programs like tax incentives, like a carbon bank, could work very well. We just have to realize that we're going to have to design them a bit differently to do what we need them to do. I think an important piece that I want to emphasize for the environmental community, conservation community, is however we design these types of incentives, those constituencies are clearly going to want to see carbon gains, or conservation gains, excuse me. Protection of high quality, high conservation lands, wetlands, and old growth forests, but also protection of unique ecosystems. The good news is, again, I go back to this, the term I used earlier, alignment. There are ways to accomplish those conservation goals through different types of incentives for landowners that will result in real conservation gains, even as we incentivize producers to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Let me mention one other thing we talk about briefly in the report, which is the potential to use crop insurance and to think about creating incentives in crop insurance as a way to address, as a way to essentially incentivize soil carbon sequestration and improved soil management across the country. It's an interesting tool. It's a very important tool to agriculture. And so if you're going to do something in crop insurance, it's a way to reach a lot of landowners, but clearly agricultural support and developing incentives that work for agriculture are going to be important. As we think about research and outreach, as I mentioned early, productivity matters. Agricultural productivity is going to matter both on the resilience side. How do we ensure that crops are more resilient, forests are more resilient in the face of climate change, but also productivity itself. We have to feed 9+ billion people by mid-century. And so we've got to grow more things, but do it in a more greenhouse gas effective way. There's lots of types of research that could be important in helping us do that, improving the productivity of crops and the greenhouse gas efficiency of crops, even as we use research in other ways, for example, to help us measure. Can we make investments in forest measurement and carbon measurement on agricultural lands that can help spur these activities as well? As I mentioned before, technical assistance is very, very critical. And we ought to look for ways not only to use the government, but to use non-governmental or state efforts. There are existing networks of conservation groups, commodity groups, conservation districts, and others out there that we can tap into. I think we ought to look for a way to do that as we design technical assistance programs. Last thing I'll say is this is about equity. If any of you know the history of USDA, the Department of Agriculture, and minority landowners, it's not a good history at all. In the last several decades, there have been efforts to right these wrongs, to make sure that minorities can fully participate in USDA programs, and ways to help tribes on tribal lands do more good conservation work. But I want to flag this issue in light of everything that's happening, but it's one we flag in the report anyway. As we think about the design of outreach in particular, we need to think about building in specific mechanisms to make sure we get it right as we do outreach to all landowners and make sure all landowners can participate in programs. Federal lands management. You're seeing here is a picture of the Bitterroot National Forest in 2000 on the left, 350,000 acre fire. Fire is going to be important. Large-scale forest restoration is going to be important. For 100 years, we've taken fire out of these ecosystems, and we've had significant fuel loads as a result. The forests are more flammable. Throw climate change in on top of that, you dry the forests out more quickly, and you have a recipe for what we're seeing in the West these days. Dealing with this problem is going to mean large-scale forest restoration. We can do that in cooperation with local communities, with the timber industry and others. It's got to be ecologically sound forest management. It's also going to mean increasing prescribed fire in the lower 48. As you think about Alaska, there's a particular issue in Alaska with large-scale fires. There's some really good research out of the Union of Concerned Scientists on things we need to do there, and it has less to do with restoration and more to do with actually putting fires out and doing fire suppression there. So I talked early about part of the thesis, for the fundamental thesis of our approach is that we need to think about a broader suite of rural investments. We need to think beyond where we get the tons and think about the businesses and investments in agriculture and forestry that can support all this. Looking for ways to do sustainable bioenergy, to improve the environmental footprint of bioenergy is one way that will have a lot of support with important rural constituencies, and that can work for the environment as well. The forest economy. Wood markets are going to be really important in keeping incentives for people not only to hold on to forests, and we lose a lot of forests to develop every year, but also to continue to invest in new forests, to reforest, forestry jobs, supporting Western mills to deal with the fire problems are going to be really important, and building the nursery capacity in forestry to actually produce the trees we need. On the agricultural side, seed technology, methane digesters, broadband, Tanya talked about, investments in productivity can all support agricultural economy, even while we improve the climate. A lot of the policy discussion now has obviously been influenced by the coronavirus. And a lot of folks in Washington now talking about economic recovery. We began this report before, well before this became a reality. But the policy landscape has changed dramatically. And I think there's an opportunity here to look at ways that natural climate solutions can not only help us solve climate problems, but actually can support rural economies and jobs. Economic impacts to agriculture from the coronavirus, you all have undoubtedly seen supply chain disruptions and others. We're going to see similar impacts on the forestry side. If housing starts are reduced as a result of a difficult economy, that's going to affect forestry. Looking for ways to bolster those economies as we promote natural climate solutions is going to be important. And there are opportunities to do it in a bipartisan way because there's so much alignment, and there's opportunities because we have existing programs, existing knowledge, we can do things that are shovel ready. Happy to take questions. Just a huge thanks to CLUA and to ClimateWorks for their support of this work. We had a lot of partnerships with a bunch of folks. I want to call out Jamie Mulligan and Alex Rudy at World Resources Institute, Kathleen Rutherford-Riggs, who was incredibly helpful. Happy to take questions on any and all of this.
Fantastic. Thank you guys both so much. That was really interesting. So right off the top, I think we have got this really interesting question from Alan Franz Lubers, who asks, if the current situation in the USA is that greenhouse gas emissions are excessive, soils are generally being degraded with conventional practices, profit margins are minimal, water quality is threatened, basically that rural livelihoods are becoming less attractive, why wouldn't rural stakeholders want to see changes to the system? Is it that they don't see the threats the same way, and would a natural climate solutions policy adequately address the way in which rural people are actually seeing the value of that livelihood?
The first thing I'd say is actually there's been a lot of really good conservation that's been undertaken on agricultural lands in the US. You've seen over the last 2 decades, you've seen huge shifts towards conservation tillage, important for soil health, reducing erosion. So I actually think we're in a lot of places headed in a good direction. If you look at US agriculture as it relates to livestock, a lot more efficient from a greenhouse gas perspective than other parts of the country. There is I think, a real interest in agriculture to participate in these solutions and to work towards efforts that are going to help the climate. These solutions aren't without risk. We're asking many of them to take on costs. Even if you shift to soil health practices, sometimes there's a 3 to 5 year payback period. If you're a forest landowner and you change your management practices, there can be a payback period. So we're asking landowners to take on some risk. So I think there will be real interest from them, but I think we're going to have to figure out ways how to finance that. And I think that's going to be a significant barrier, but it's not the only barrier. Technical assistance, this stuff is, some of it's new. There are new technologies, new practices. So we're going to need outreach and to build capacity there. So there are lots, because of the alignment I talked about, there's actually a lot of reason to be optimistic here. And there's a lot of support in rural America beyond agriculture and forestry for these types of support. So these types of approaches. So I do think there's reason to be optimistic.
Great, fantastic. Tanya, anything else to add there?
I just wanted to underscore what Robert said about the risk factor. I mean, and technical assistance. Like, those are 2 really big points. Just farmers in general are risk averse. I mean, they're constantly managing for risk. And so, you know, when you talk about helping them adopt these practices, I think it's really important to keep in mind what kind of things can be part of policies that reduce risk and protect them when they make an investment. So for instance, like a farmer that does an anaerobic digester project for carbon offsets or renewable natural gas payments, say something happens to his herd. Well, then he can't live up to that contract for the RNG. What kind of measures can be put in place to protect that? So the person who's purchasing the offset or the RNG is covered, and at the same time, the farmer can still make payments on the system that he's probably taken a loan out for. So those are really important things that have to be incorporated in this, and I think it'll address the things that tend to keep people from taking these measures.
Totally. Okay, so the next question we've got up is from Suzanne Rees. She asks, can you speak to the dominance of commodity crops such as corn and soybeans in the crop insurance system, the farm lending system, this whole agricultural ecosystem? How can the playing field be tilted to advantage perennial crops and small grains within the kind of monolithic framework that already exists?
There's a lot of interest in looking for ways to perennialize some of these grain crops. And World Resources Institute's done some good work on this. Others have as well. And that's probably a longer range solution, whether we get to a place where we can do that. But you're already starting to see changes in some of the crop insurance program to actually incentivize some of these types of practices. Turns out that if you use conservation tillage or cover crops or other soil health practices, that your risk in the face of drought or other extreme weather events, flooding and other things, is reduced. And so in places like Iowa, they're starting to create insurance products that actually reward producers for some of those changes. And so thinking about incentives like that, thinking about ways to finance, I think is important. I want to draw on something Tanya said, which is, I think, really important. Particularly on the agricultural side, a lot of producers are taking out debt every year to plant a crop. They get a USDA loan, or they've got debt on equipment. And so that risk is an important issue. And thinking about how we reduce that risk through incentives and through those types of approaches, I think is going to be important.
You're muted.
Great, Tanya, anything else to add?
No, I'm good.
Okay, so then the next question that we had is, what are the top few specific federal policy changes that you would like to see implemented in the next 1 to 2 years? If you had your dream team of policy interventions.
So I'll start off, and then Tanya, you chime in. As you can probably tell, I am somewhat doubtful that we're going to see a cap and trade program or offsets. But I do think there's a real opportunity in thinking about building some finance tools like a carbon bank or others that could be important. And I think the interesting thing about thinking about a carbon bank is it probably can do most of it under current law. And so thinking about some creative ways to use the Commodity Credit Corporation to work with landowners to do it in a transparent way so the public can see it, to build some of these tools to deal with risk, whether it's a reverse auction, insurance, or other things, I think would be really, really important. And the other thing I'll say is on the forestry side, a recognition that if we invest in reforestation, if we invest in improved forest management, we're also going to have to think about markets. We've got to, whether you're an agricultural producer or a forest landowner, we've got to keep these folks in business. They're going to have to be economically viable in order to produce the greenhouse gas emissions we need. And so thinking about those things, I think in policy is going to be important.
I'm writing down mine, and the more Robert was talking, the more I added to my list. So I'll stick to 3. First of all, I would love to see some, like I was describing with the U.S. Climate Alliance and modeling and being able to really target what we need to be doing first and what we need to be prioritizing, because I keep coming back to the need for immediacy and the need to scale very quickly with respect to natural climate solutions, because this is when they count. Like if we get our act together and start doing this in 2030, we're going to miss a huge opportunity, and it's not going to do what it's supposed to do. So we have to start now, and we have to start pretty big now. And I'm a believer that, you have to do some planning to make sure that you're getting to the priorities. It's going to help in terms of making sure you're getting lowest cost carbon reductions, as well as, again, it goes to biggest bang for your buck. It also goes for the best way to get carbon reductions fast. So I would say having really good modeling tools and getting those into state hands, that states who know that can learn from that and know what their capability is and start setting targets. I think the federal government can be a key in terms of supporting states and do that. And it can be a bit of an iterative or communication between the states and the feds. The second thing I will say is technical assistance. I'll say that 3 times. There's been such a big cut in technical assistance. Our NRCS offices, and particularly extension, they're really hurting in terms of being able to service the folks on the ground. And I think the folks on the ground really miss that. So, if it's, and this goes to perhaps spending for economic recovery, you could see either technical assistance by rebuilding USDA staff. I don't know if that's what USDA wants to do. If not, then put that money into the hands of those who already have relationships in rural areas, so they can build up technical assistance and maybe serve in that role, as Robert was talking about. Like other organizations can do that. Lastly, I'll say, and one more thing about technical assistance, I think we can start thinking about technical assistance as also in a recruitment opportunity, because farmers, I'm going to speak about farmers more than foresters, but same goes for foresters. They don't, there's so much going on, you can't really know what opportunities are there. So I think we might start to think about more recruitment and going out to people and letting them know what the opportunities are, rather than kind of putting the program out there and people finding on a website. Then lastly, I'll say pathways to markets and infrastructure. A lot of people want to do renewable energy projects, but they can't get their product to market. There's a lot of barriers in their way. And finding ways to reduce those barriers, I think is really important. So those are just a few of the things I'd want to see.
Fantastic. And I think going off of your point about technical assistance, another great question that we've had is saying, you know, NRCS programs are often oversubscribed, conservation districts are perennially underfunded. So how do we find the resources to better support the parts of our current system of agricultural conservation that are already doing their part?
This is a critical point, and I said it, I'll say it again. These programs don't implement themselves. And when I was at USDA, there was always a back and forth between those of us at the Department of Agriculture and the Office of Management Budget about how much of the Farm Bill programs to dedicate to technical assistance and how much to do straight financial assistance. If you want to produce good products, good projects, I should say, you need to invest in technical assistance. And so I think we've got to think about, again, it doesn't just have to be, we need boots on the ground, but it doesn't just have to be government boots. It can be the private sector. It can be conservation partners. It can be commodity groups. There's some commodity groups that are doing great work. The Illinois corn growers, great work on conservation. Iowa Soybean Association, some great work. And so thinking about how you fund that is going to be important. Recognizing that it's not all going to be federal resources. And then I think for something like whether it's a carbon bank or something like that, to think about how you build it so that you can actually finance some of that too is going to be important.
I'll just add to that in terms of how to pay for it. I mean, some of the things to think about with respect to carbon offset projects. I mean, if there's some type of banking of carbon reductions, I mean, perhaps there's a way for proceeds from carbon sales to go to fund the technical assistance or support that, or support the offices doing that. There's ways I think that you can start to build in payments for the services into the so-called, you know, the carbon product.
Fantastic. So I'm aware it's 2 o'clock, but we have a bunch of questions. Are you guys good if we go for another 5 minutes or so?
I'm good to go.
Mm-hmm.
Fantastic. So shifting gears to think about forestry now, somebody's asked, so how would you respond to those in the forest products industry who may perceive IFM on public forest lands as a threat to fiber supply for mills?
Yeah, so my experience, I spent an enormous amount of time at my days in USDA thinking about fire, and in particular in restoration and management of the federal land base. If you look at the mill infrastructure in the US, the mills that we have currently out in the West that draw on that public land base are critically important to do that restoration. But they have challenges, particularly relates to timber supply. There is a world of opportunity on federal lands to both supply the necessary timber and to do it in a way that will ecologically improve our forests. And so I don't think there is a big rub between the industry in the West and management of those lands. There are places, spotted owl habitat, the Tongass National Forest, where we're going to need to protect old growth forests. And I don't think there's going to be a significant conflict there. I think those battles have largely been fought. The place where, I think maybe there's not enough recognition yet is this idea I talked a little bit about is everything you want to do on forests, reforestation, forest restoration, improving stocking on private lands. There's a market component we need to think about. So things like mass timber, cross-laminated timber, new types of timber management that can support that type of management are going to be important. And I think that's a place where industry and forest landowners are going to be really interested. And from a kind of a political standpoint and thinking how you put the coalition together, for forest landowners and forest industry, markets are going to matter.
Anything you want to add to that, Tanya?
I defer to Robert on forestry.
All right, then sorry, Robert, one more forestry question for you. So then how is it that you're envisioning the role of family-owned forests versus industrial timberlands versus public forests? Also, mass timber and CLTs have been put forward as a climate solution, but could also promote increased harvesting. Could you talk a little bit about that?
So there's some great work being done on how you aggregate smaller landowners. I'd say the work that American Forest Foundation is doing, TNC, the recent investment from Amazon. And so there's work out there to figure out how do you aggregate these landowners, how do you spread the costs of measurement and technical assistance across lots of landowners. Those types of things are going to be important. And so whether it's an offsets program or a bank or incentives, how we pick up those costs of outreach are important. And they're sometimes difficult on the forest land side because you have a lot of absentee landowners. But we've also got a lot of big landowners, timber management organization and REITs that have access to a lot of land and the ability to work with them to change big landscapes. And I'll recommend another project to you, which is a coastal headwaters project that RMS has down in Florida and Alabama, where they are essentially restoring longleaf pine on tens of thousands of acres through an agreement with USDA. The Conservation Fund has been involved, and great for endangered species. And it provides a model for how we might engage some of those landowners. What is clear is that markets are going to matter. We want to incentivize good management and keep markets in place. There's always concerns when you have markets around forest sustainability. We've developed certification, best management practices, and things like that to deal with it. But if you think about the US forest sink and what the threats are, there are really two big threats. One is we're going to lose land to development. And that's even as we're aggrading lots of carbon on our forests, there's a spigot that's spewing out carbon because of land development. Mm-hmm. And forest management and those markets and keeping forestry viable from an economic standpoint is going to matter. And the second big threat is actually disturbance, fire, insects, disease. Here again, ecologically sound management, thinning, and other things can improve the health of forests. And so we've always dealt with sustainability issues in timber markets. We've developed a lot of tools to do it. We're going to have to do it here too, because that working land base that we have right now, that's the real engine of a lot of the carbon sequestration out there. And so the question is, how do we do it in a sustainable way, support landowners, keep forests as forests?
I will add one thing to that, and it's the tackling the aggregation part of smaller forest holdings. You know, as someone who worked on developing carbon offset projects, that used to be what I did at Duke University. And we were very, very interested in forestry projects and would have loved to be in a position or have more forest landowners that we were helping. But, you know, a dream was figuring out how to do aggregation and also spread the costs. That part of that would mean spreading the costs of measurement and verification, for instance. I think those are the kinds of things, just to reiterate what Robert said and add a little color to it, that is going to help a lot in terms of providing some income to folks so they don't choose development or land sale.
Fantastic. So I've got one last question for you, hopefully to bring it to a bit of a higher level for the last one. So the final question is, it's a two-parter. Where are the existing allies in the Department of Agriculture or related government programs interested in forwarding these kinds of incentive programs? And or are we thinking about starting from scratch and waiting for a new administration? What's your vision of the way this works?
Look, there's no mystery about the fact that the current administration isn't doing a lot to address climate change. Everybody knows that. However, at the Department of Agriculture, they're doing a lot on soil health. They're doing a lot on forest restoration. They're enrolling lands in CRP. None of that stuff is called climate change, but it's actually helping on climate change. And so the Farm Bill programs, the efforts that the U.S. Forest Service is doing, the Department of Interior, the work of some folks in BLM and National Park Service and Fish and Wildlife Service. There are folks in all those agencies that are doing climate change stuff right now. It's just not being called climate change stuff. Mm-hmm. And you've built an infrastructure of folks. I mean, I can just tell you from my experience at the Department of Agriculture, I sometimes felt like we were at the Department of Disaster, because we were dealing with floods, we were dealing with drought, we were dealing with wildfire, and all those things carbon has played a role. And so those agencies have built up an infrastructure of people that are dealing with these issues. There is a group of folks right now in all those agencies that are prepared to deal with this. We have to empower them and look for ways to provide the resources they need to get this done. Of course, it's going to matter who's in the White House, but there are opportunities on both sides, and you're starting to see even in USDA some interest in thinking about sustainability issues and thinking about carbon sequestration. So, you know, there actually reason to be optimistic. Again, who's in the White House always, of course, matters on these things. But I think you've got, people tend to be pretty cynical about the government, but I will tell you that there are a lot of really, really good career folks in the federal government. The same's true in the states, still there, still expert on this stuff, and will be raring to go if they get the signal.
I will say I was chuckling because of the political nature of that question. So, and I like to stay away from that. But the allies question, I think we have a ton of allies in USDA and across the federal government at the state level too. They are doing exactly what Robert said, which is getting this work done, and it just might have a different name. In North Carolina, at the state level, we haven't been able to use climate change in any kind of legislative proposals. We haven't been able to use even sustainability, economic sustainability, got a little too close to climate. However, you know, it's if you're talking about that side of the political spectrum that's kind of not comfortable with climate, if you start to talk about access to new markets and new product development for farmers and forest landowners, that's really exciting to them. And you can move stuff that way. So that's just one way of kind of navigating the general issue I think that the person asking is getting at. And then I would say that, you know, again, there are a lot of people at the staff level in the agencies, at the NRCS offices, who are carrying the water on this and finding ways to work the programs. And they did it before, they're still doing it, they're going to do it in the future. I think if we've got better, just general better policy like the ones we're describing, they can be a lot more effective and empowered to scale.
Fantastic. Well, now that we're at 2:11, thank you both so much for sharing with everyone and for sharing the questions. And thank you everyone who attended and all of your fantastically thoughtful questions. I know we could only get to a fraction of them, so those questions will definitely get passed on to Robert and Tanya. And so just to wrap up, we've been recording this. This recording will be available on YouTube, and we will send it around to everyone so that you'll have access to it. And if you want to read the full report, it's at bit.ly/rural investment report. And we'll definitely include that link when we email everyone later about this as well. So thank you guys so much.
Thanks everyone for your time.